Millionaire lets an elderly homeless woman stay in his luxury mansion. But when he came home, the rain fell relentlessly, turning the streets of Manhattan into a shimmering labyrinth of reflections. Nicholas Carter, 29, millionaire by fortune and orphan by fate, wandered aimlessly through the dimly lit avenues. The city that never sleeps seemed quieter tonight, muted by the downpour. The familiar ache of loss gnawed at him, a dull reminder of the car crash that had stolen his parents 2 years ago. Despite his wealth, Nicholas often found himself drawn to these solitary walks, searching for something he couldn't quite name. As he crossed a small park, the faint hum of a tune caught his attention. It was fragile, like a whisper carried on the wind, and it stopped him in his tracks. He turned his head, scanning the shadows. Beneath a small, flickering street lamp, a figure sat hunched against the cold, clutching a soaked blanket. Her gray hair clung to her face, and her frail frame shivered against the biting wind. Nicholas hesitated. He had passed countless homeless individuals before. New York was full of them, but something about this woman felt different. Her presence tugged at him, though he couldn't explain why. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, stepping closer. His polished leather shoes splashed through a puddle, and he winced at the sound. The woman flinched, drawing the blanket tighter. "I don't want any trouble," she murmured, her voice raspy but steady. "I'm not here to bother you," Nicholas replied, raising his hands. "It's just, well, you shouldn't be out here in this weather. Can I help you? Maybe get you somewhere warm?" She looked up then, her eyes sharp, despite the wear of years etched into her face. "Help," she scoffed, though her voice betrayed exhaustion. "What's a man like you doing offering help to someone like me?" Nicholas wasn't sure how to answer. He wasn't entirely sure why he'd stopped. He glanced at her thin jacket, soaked through. "You'll get sick out here." The woman chuckled dryly, a sound without humor. "Sweetheart, if the cold wanted me dead, it would have done the job years ago." Despite himself, Nicholas smiled. There was strength in her, even in this state. "At least let me get you a cup of coffee," he offered. "There's a diner a block away." She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for a hidden motive. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. Coffee." Nicholas helped her to her feet, surprised by how light she was, like carrying a bundle of dry twigs. They walked slowly, the rain soaking them both despite his umbrella. The diner was almost empty, a haven of warmth and light in the dreary night. He guided her to a booth near the window, ignoring the sideways glances from the server. "What's your name?" Nicholas asked once they were seated. "Grace," she said, wrapping her hands around the steaming mug the waitress had placed in front of her. "That's all you need to know." "All right, Grace, I'm Nicholas." "Figures," she muttered, eyeing his tailored coat. "You've got that rich boy look." Nicholas couldn't help but laugh. "Fair enough. But even rich boys don't usually stroll around offering coffee to strangers in the middle of the night." "Guess that makes you a strange rich boy," Grace shot back, though there was a flicker of warmth in her tone now. They sat in silence for a moment, the rain tapping against the windows. Grace sipped her coffee and Nicholas found himself watching her, noticing the way her hands trembled slightly and the distant look in her eyes. "Where do you stay?" he asked gently. Grace's gaze snapped to him, her defenses rising again. "Why do you care?" "Because you shouldn't be out there," he said simply. "Look, I have a house, plenty of space. You don't have to stay long, just until you're back on your feet." Grace laughed again, but this time it was bitter. "Back on my feet? Kid, I've been on the ground so long I wouldn't know what standing felt like." Nicholas leaned forward. "Then maybe it's time someone helped you stand." Grace stared at him, the weight of years reflected in her expression. For a moment, Nicholas thought she might refuse, but then she sighed and looked away. "Fine, but don't think I'm some charity case." "I wouldn't dare," he said with a smile. As they left the diner, Nicholas felt something shift in him. He didn't know what had drawn him to Grace or why he had insisted on helping her, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of purpose. Little did he know that flicker would ignite into something far greater than he could imagine. The sprawling Carter estate sat on the edge of Long Island, a massive testament to old money and architectural indulgence. For Grace, Stepping inside was like entering a world she had only seen on the glossy pages of magazines decades ago. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath glittering chandeliers, and every corner of the mansion seemed to hum with quiet luxury. "This place," she muttered, clutching her worn bag, "it's like a palace." Nicholas set her a reassuring smile. "It's just a house. Come on, I'll show you your room." She followed him through the halls, her worn sneakers barely making a sound on the polished floors. Nicholas led her to a cozy guest room, simpler than the rest of the mansion, but still far more elegant than anything Grace had seen in years. A four-poster bed, soft lighting, and thick curtains gave the space a sense of warmth. "Bathroom's through there," Nicholas said, pointing to a door, "and if you need anything, just let me know." Grace hesitated in the doorway, her fingers brushing against the frame. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice cautious. Nicholas paused, considering the question. "Honestly, I'm not sure, I just—" He glanced at her, at the lines etched into her face and the shadows in her eyes. "I just felt like I had to." Grace studied him for a moment longer before stepping inside. She didn't say thank you, but the slight nod she gave him felt more meaningful than words. As the days passed, Grace settled into a routine. She spent most of her time in the guest room, venturing out only for meals or brief walks in the garden. Nicholas gave her space, sensing she needed time to adjust, but he couldn't help his curiosity. There was something about her, a mystery he couldn't quite put his finger on. One afternoon, he found her standing in the library, staring at a shelf of records that once belonged to his mother. Her fingers hovered over a vinyl case, her expression distant. "You like music?" he asked, stepping into the room. Grace flinched slightly but didn't turn around. "Used to." "Used to," he pressed gently. She picked up the record, a jazz classic, and examined the cover. "Music was my life once," she said softly, "but that was a long time ago." Nicholas watched her, intrigued. "You were a musician?" Grace set the record down and turned to face him, her defenses snapping back into place. "Why do you care?" "Because I want to know you," he said simply. "You're not just some random person I found on the street. There's something about you." For a moment, Grace seemed torn between anger and sorrow. Then she shook her head. "You're wasting your time, kid. The past is the past." But Nicholas couldn't let it go. That night, as Grace retreated to her room, he sat in his office searching for answers. A hunch led him to dig deeper into her name, and within hours, he found something extraordinary. An old newspaper clipping from the late 1970s. It featured a photo of a vibrant, glamorous woman on stage, her arms raised in triumph as a crowd roared beneath her. It was Grace. The headline read, "Grace Monroe, America's Songbird, shines at Madison Square Garden." Nicholas stared at the image, stunned. The woman in the photo was almost unrecognizable from the frail figure now staying in his guest room, but the eyes were the same, sharp and full of life. The next morning, he confronted her. "You were famous," he said, holding up the printout of the article. "You were a singer." Grace's face hardened when she saw the paper. She grabbed it from his hand, crumpling it in her fists. "You had no right to dig into my life." "I just wanted to understand," Nicholas said, his voice calm but insistent. "What happened to you?" "What happened?" Grace laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. "What happened is I trusted the wrong man. He took everything from me, my money, my career, my life, and when it all fell apart, he left me to clean up the mess." Nicholas's chest tightened at the pain in her voice. "Who was he?" "George," she spat, her tone venomous. "My husband. He was supposed to love me, protect me. Instead, he used me." She turned away, her shoulders trembling. For a moment, Nicholas thought she might cry, but she straightened herself, her voice steady again. "That's all you need to know." Nicholas didn't press her further, but the revelation haunted him. Grace wasn't just another person down on her luck. She was someone who had once lived a life of brilliance and success, only to have it all stolen from her. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, more that she wasn't ready to share. And deep down, Nicholas felt an unfamiliar determination. Grace had been abandoned by the world, but he wouldn't let her be forgotten. Not again. The days passed quietly, but the air in the Carter mansion was charged with unspoken truths. Nicholas couldn't stop thinking about Grace's story or the parts of it she had revealed. The image of her, radiant on stage in that old newspaper clipping, lingered in his mind. He wanted to know more, but Grace had made it clear she wasn't ready to share. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Nicholas found Grace sitting by the grand piano in the music room. Her fingers hovered above the keys, hesitant. The soft glow of twilight bathed the room in amber light, and for a moment she seemed lost in another time. "You play?" Nicholas asked, stepping into the room. Grace startled slightly, pulling her hands back. "Not anymore," she said curtly. "You should," he said, sitting on a nearby chair. "Music was your life once, wasn't it?" Grace shot him a sharp look but didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to the piano, her gaze distant. After a long pause, she said, "Do you have any idea what it's like to lose everything? To have the world at your feet one moment and be completely forgotten the next?" Nicholas didn't answer immediately. He thought about his parents, about the void their absence had left in his life. "I don't know what it's like to lose what you had," he said carefully. "But I do know what it's like to feel empty, to wonder if life has any meaning." Grace's expression softened, and for the first time, Nicholas saw a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. "I didn't just lose my career," she said quietly. "I lost myself. And I lost—" She stopped, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter." "It does matter," Nicholas said, leaning forward. "You matter, Grace. Whatever happened to you, it doesn't define who you are now." Grace laughed bitterly. "And who am I now? A washed-up nobody living off your charity?" "No," Nicholas said firmly. "You're someone who's been through hell and survived. That's worth something." Grace didn't respond, but something in her posture shifted, as if a weight had been lifted, if only slightly. Later that night, Nicholas couldn't sleep. Grace's words haunted him, and he felt a growing need to piece together the fragments of her story. He spent hours online, digging through archives and old interviews. What he found was both fascinating and heartbreaking. Grace Monroe had been a household name in the 1970s, a singer whose soulful voice and heartfelt lyrics had captivated millions. But behind the glamour, her life had been anything but charmed. Articles detailed her tumultuous marriage to George Monroe, a music producer who had initially helped launch her career, but later became her downfall. Whispers of his infidelity, financial mismanagement, and controlling behavior filled the tabloid headlines of the time. The final blow had come in the early 1980s. Grace had filed for divorce, but by then, her reputation had been tarnished by rumors of substance abuse, fueled in part by George's manipulations. Her career faltered, and within a few years, she had disappeared from the public eye. Nicholas found an old interview clip from a talk show. In it, a younger Grace sat poised but visibly weary, deflecting invasive questions about her marriage and struggles. The host's condescending tone made Nicholas's blood boil. The next morning he approached Grace with what he had learned. "I know about George," he said gently. Grace froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "What about him?" "I know what he did to you," Nicholas said, sitting across from her. "I know how he used you and took everything you worked for." Grace set the cup down, her hands trembling slightly. "And what? You think you're going to fix it, undo 40 years of damage?" "No," Nicholas admitted, "but I think you deserve to heal, and maybe, just maybe, you can take back some of what he stole from you." Grace stared at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, kid." "Maybe not," Nicholas said with a small smile, "but I'm stubborn, and I'm not giving up on you." For the first time, Grace allowed herself a genuine smile. It was faint and fleeting, but it was there. Over the following weeks, Nicholas and Grace began to open up to each other. Nicholas shared stories of his parents, of how their sudden death had left him adrift despite his wealth. Grace, in turn, began to reveal more about her past, the highs of her career, the thrill of performing for thousands, and the crushing lows of losing everything. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Grace spoke of her daughter, Megan. "She was just a kid when everything fell apart," Grace said, her voice thick with regret. I wasn't a good mother. I wasn't there for her when she needed me most." "What happened to her?" Nicholas asked. "She left," Grace said simply. "She wanted nothing to do with me or George. Last I heard, she moved to California, but that was decades ago." Nicholas felt a pang of sympathy. He could see the pain in Grace's eyes, the guilt she carried like a heavy chain. "Do you ever think about finding her?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "She's better off without me." Nicholas didn't argue, but he made a silent promise to himself. If there was any chance of reuniting Grace with her daughter, he would find a way. Nicholas sat in his office, staring at the screen of his laptop. The search engine results displayed dozens of listings for a man named George Monroe. After weeks of researching Grace's past, he had finally decided to track down the person who had caused her so much pain. It wasn't out of morbid curiosity, it was out of a growing desire to help Grace confront the demons that had shadowed her life. With a deep breath, he clicked on one of the more recent entries, Sunrise Haven Assisted Living Facility. The accompanying image showed a modest building in upstate New York. Nicholas skimmed the brief biography. George Monroe, aged 74, was listed as a resident. His condition wasn't detailed, but Nicholas didn't need much imagination to guess. The next morning, Nicholas told Grace he had errands to run. He didn't elaborate, and Grace didn't press him. She had grown accustomed to his comings and goings. As he drove out of Manhattan and into the quieter countryside, Nicholas rehearsed what he would say. How do you confront a man who had left a legacy of destruction? The assisted living facility was peaceful, with neatly trimmed hedges and a wide porch where a few elderly residents sat chatting. Inside, the receptionist led him to a small room at the end of a hallway. When Nicholas stepped inside, he saw a man sitting in a wheelchair, his once imposing frame now hunched and frail. George Monroe's face was lined with age, his eyes dull and sunken. The aura of power and charm that had defined him decades ago had long since faded. "Mr. Monroe?" Nicholas said, his voice steady. George turned his head slowly, squinting at the young man before him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice raspy. "My name is Nicholas Carter," he said. "I'm here about Grace." George's reaction was immediate. His expression flickered with recognition and something that looked like shame. "Grace," he repeated softly. "She's still alive." "Yes," Nicholas said. "She's alive, but she's been through hell because of you." George closed his eyes, his head sinking forward. "I know," he murmured. "I know what I did to her. I've had years to think about it. Too many years." Nicholas leaned forward, his tone firm but not unkind. "Do you regret it?" George looked up, his eyes glistening. "Every damn day. I loved her, you know. But I didn't know how to love her right. I was selfish, arrogant. I thought I could control her. And when she started slipping away, I just made it worse." Nicholas studied the man before him, searching for sincerity. "Grace deserves to hear that," he said finally. "She deserves an apology." George shook his head. "She'd never forgive me." "You don't know that," Nicholas said. "But if you're truly sorry, don't you think she has a right to hear it?" George didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window, his face a mask of regret. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said hoarsely. "I'll talk to her, if she'll even see me." Convincing Grace was another challenge entirely. When Nicholas returned to the mansion and told her what he had done, her reaction was explosive. "You had no right," she shouted, her voice shaking with anger. "I told you I wanted nothing to do with him." "I know," Nicholas said, standing his ground. "But you deserve closure, Grace. You deserve to hear him apologize." "I don't need an apology," she snapped. "What I need is for him to stay out of my life." Nicholas hesitated, then said quietly, "What if it's not about him? What if it's about you? About letting go of the pain he caused you?" Grace glared at him, her hands clenched into fists. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. After a long silence, she sighed heavily. "Fine. But don't expect me to forgive him." The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon. Nicholas drove Grace to the assisted living facility, the tension in the car palpable. She sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her face a mask of resolve, but her hands betrayed her, fidgeting nervously in her lap. When they arrived, Grace hesitated at the entrance. "You don't have to do this," Nicholas said gently. "Yes, I do," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. They walked to George's room in silence. When Grace stepped inside, George looked up, his expression a mix of shock and sorrow. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of decades hung heavy in the air. "You look old," Grace said finally, her tone sharp, but lacking true venom. George managed a weak smile. "So do you." Grace crossed her arms, keeping her distance. "Why am I here, George?" "Because I needed to say I'm sorry," he said simply. "For everything. For hurting you, for ruining your career, for pushing you away. I was a bastard, Grace, I know that now." Grace's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. "I loved you," George continued, his voice trembling. "But I didn't know how to show it. I was too wrapped up in myself to see what I was doing to you, and by the time I realized it was too late." Grace's eyes glistened, but she blinked back the tears. "You destroyed me, George. You took everything I had and left me with nothing." "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "And I'll carry that guilt to my grave." There was a long silence. Then Grace took a deep breath. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, her voice softer now. "But I'm tired of carrying this anger. It's been eating me alive." George nodded, tears streaming down his face. "That's all I can ask for." As they left the facility, Grace was quiet. Nicholas didn't press her, sensing she needed time to process. But when they arrived back at the mansion, she turned to him and said, "Thank you." "For what?" Nicholas asked. "For not giving up on me," she said, "even when I wanted to give up on myself." The soft hum of the city outside was a sharp contrast to the flurry of emotions stirring within the Carter mansion. Weeks had passed since Grace's confrontation with George. The visit had left her raw, but something in her demeanor had shifted. She was lighter, freer, though still guarded. Nicholas noticed it in the way she moved through the house, her steps less burdened by invisible chains. One evening, while sitting by the fire, Grace mentioned Megan. It wasn't much, just a passing remark about her daughter's love of music when she was a child, but it was enough for Nicholas to latch on to. "Do you ever wonder where she is now?" he asked cautiously. Grace hesitated, her eyes fixed on the flames. "Every day," she admitted, "but I wouldn't know where to start. And even if I found her, I'm not sure she'd want to see me." Nicholas leaned forward. "What if I could find her?" Grace turned to him sharply. "Don't, Nicholas. She's better off without me." "I don't believe that," he said, "and I don't think you do either." She opened her mouth to argue, but closed it again, her expression conflicted. Finally, she sighed. "Do what you want, but don't expect a happy ending." Nicholas dove into the search with determination. Tracking Megan wasn't easy. Decades of separation and a common name complicated things, but he was relentless. After weeks of calls, emails, and digging through public records, he found her. Megan Monroe was living in Los Angeles, working as a music therapist. The irony wasn't lost on Nicholas, a woman estranged from her own mother helping others find healing through music. He reached out, carefully crafting his message to avoid overwhelming her. When Megan finally replied, her response was cautious but curious. She agreed to a phone call, and Nicholas spent hours explaining everything: Grace's struggles, her regret, and her desire to reconnect. Megan was silent for a long time before she spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive her," she said, "but I think I need to see her." Nicholas arranged for Megan to fly to New York under the guise of attending a local music festival. He kept the plan a secret from Grace, hoping the surprise would be a catalyst for something profound. The festival was a community event, a vibrant celebration of music and art held in a park just outside the city. Grace had reluctantly agreed to attend after much coaxing from Nicholas. She had resisted at first, but the promise of live music and the chance to remain anonymous in the crowd had swayed her. As they arrived, the park buzzed with energy. Stages were set up under colorful canopies, and the air was filled with the hum of conversation and the distant strumming of guitars. Grace wandered through the festival, her expression a mix of nostalgia and unease. It wasn't until the main stage performance that everything came together. Nicholas guided Grace to a prime spot near the front, where a small group of musicians was setting up. Grace didn't recognize them, but there was something familiar about the woman standing at the microphone. Tall, with sharp features and a presence that commanded attention, she bore a striking resemblance to Grace in her younger years. The first notes of the performance filled the air, soft and haunting. Megan's voice was rich and soulful, carrying the kind of emotion that silenced the crowd. Grace froze, her breath catching in her throat as recognition dawned. "Megan?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. Nicholas placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's her," he said softly. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she watched her daughter perform. The years melted away, replaced by a flood of memories, some beautiful, some painful. When the song ended, Megan scanned the crowd, her eyes searching. Then she spotted Grace. The world seemed to pause as their gazes locked. Megan stepped down from the stage, her movements deliberate, her expression unreadable. The crowd parted instinctively, giving the two women space. When Megan finally reached her, she stood still, her arms at her sides. "Hi, Mum," she said softly. Grace choked on a sob, covering her mouth with her hand. "Megan, I'm so sorry." For a moment, it seemed Megan might turn away. But then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her mother. The embrace was tentative at first, but it grew stronger as the weight of years dissolved between them. Later that evening, Nicholas watched from the edge of the stage as Grace and Megan sat together talking quietly. The festival continued around them, but they seemed untouched by the noise, lost in their own world. When Nicholas approached, Megan looked up and smiled. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Nicholas nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose. Watching Grace and Megan reconnect, he realized that helping people wasn't just an act of kindness, it was what gave his life meaning. In the weeks that followed, Grace and Megan spent more time together, rebuilding the bond they had lost. With Megan's encouragement, Grace began singing again, her voice gaining strength with each rehearsal. Nicholas, ever the quiet supporter, arranged for Grace to perform at a small charity concert. The night of the concert, Megan surprised her mother by joining her on stage. Together they performed a song that Grace had written long ago but never recorded. A song about love, loss, and forgiveness. The audience erupted into applause. But for Grace, the real victory was the woman standing beside her. As the final notes faded, Grace turned to Nicholas, who stood watching from the wings. She smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she mouthed. Nicholas simply nodded, his heart full. The story didn't end that night. It was only the beginning. Grace continued to rebuild her life, her relationship with Megan growing stronger each day. And Nicholas, inspired by their journey, began his own, a mission to bring hope and healing to those who needed it most. For the first time in years, Nicholas felt whole, and as he looked to the future, he knew he had finally found his purpose.